Welcome to the Ohio Arts Council's Rife Gallery Artist Talk series for our current exhibition, Shift, Thinking Globally, Acting Locally. The OAC Rife Gallery is thrilled to present Zhang, one of our exhibiting artists. As always, if you have questions along the way, please drop them into the comments or the chat, and we'll be sure to pick them up during the Q&A portion of the hour. Now to you, Ha.
Thanks, Kat. Thank you all for tuning in and listening to me talk about my work. As Kat said, my name is Ha. I'm a multidisciplinary artist. I'm also an educator teaching at the University of Cincinnati. And for my practice, I work between the realms of ceramics, fiber, sculpture, photo, video, and recorded performance to create these visual representations of how I perceive internal and external world. And I view my art practice and research to be essentially like a unlearning of assimilation, and in turn then a repairing of self and understanding authenticity within self. And I contemplate how the physical body is seen in the public sphere of whiteness and then privately within itself. I work through a lot of processes of craft and documented actions that allow for consideration of how ethnic and feminine identity is laboriously performed and endure for the sake of belonging. And so I'm going to start off a little bit with how I got into making art. I didn't really understand that art could be a practice that could become a career until I went to college, and it wasn't even until my junior year in which I took a ceramics class, and I began as a vessel maker, and I was really thinking about the human body as a vessel for experiences and understanding the bits and pieces of why we are the way we are, especially with like how we talk about pottery. We talk about like the mouth of the pot, the foot of the pot, the body of it, and also like thinking about jars as like forms of containment. And then when vessels are no longer, in its utilitarian purpose, then they become sculptural, and how they exist in the world is really just interesting to me. And so I found myself really gravitating though toward more 3D objects and considering them on the body as a site rather than just like an object. So thinking about how they could interact with the body, and then thinking about how objects and bodies bend to assimilate each other. I moved a lot away from object to installation-based work to create more experiential pieces to be shared and felt more viscerally. And this is called Belongingness. And I was really challenging the idea of a vessel by, but still using the wheel as a tool to throw all these individual ceramic cylinders. And these are, I don't know how many, but there are thousands of these individual thrown cylinder forms that don't have bases to them. So I was thinking of them as they are empty, yet they occupy space, which is a feeling that I was coming to terms with as a perpetual outsider to the norm. And I think of the norm as being centered on whiteness. So this piece, Belongingness, like now in hindsight of it, 10 years later, I think it is a lot to do with the idea of shame and how belongingness is an effect of it, whether you fit into a space or you don't. And I realized that shame is this underlining driver of my practice. It's very much like a master emotion behind all of us. It is this never good enough emotion where we feel like when we don't address our shame and allow it to fester, we stunt our emotional growth and capacity for vulnerability. It feeds these feelings of disconnection and isolation within ourselves, and grow walls between us and then our environment around. And so it's similar to how fear feeds hate, and one is more internalized, the other is externalized. And a constant within my work is repetition as a way to understand cycles of trauma. And so this question of, belonging to a space, I get asked the question of like, where are you from a lot? And it's a question that a lot of brown folks get asked. It's frustrating because at the core of that question, I already know what that person sees me as, which is like a perpetual outsider. And despite my very American accent, I will never fully be accepted as American, no matter how much I might try to assimilate or to fit in. And so this is this map of China. I was born in Imping, China, which is right here. But I grew up in the suburbs outside of Baltimore and then went to undergrad in a school called Slippery Rock University in Pennsylvania. And thinking back on how I now understand my personhood, a lot of it is viewed through white dominant spaces in especially through academia. And I went straight to grad school after undergrad in West Virginia, where I met much of the experience of being there was being gaslit about my identity and if I was truly like how Chinese I really was. And it was in these academic spaces that taught me a lot of what not to do, especially as an educator today, because academia is a space that perpetuates a lot of imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist, patriarchal ideas and standards that I think are underlining concepts behind much of institutions that we view as being foundational to our society. And so when I went straight into grad school, my first semester was abroad in Jingdezhen, China. Jingdezhen is like right in here in Jiangxi province. And so it was in Jingdezhen where it is considered to be the birthplace of porcelain. It's this original city where ceramics was globalized and became a status symbol. Like all the porcelain that came out of it was a status symbol object starting from 1573. And this city still caters to a lot of Western artists who go and they pay artisans a very cheap rate and then like they have artisans that go through each process, whether it's like mold making, making clay, glazing the work, buying glazes from the shop, taking it to the communal kilns, and even like packing it all up and crating it. There's someone whose job is to do each step of the process. And it was really interesting to me how there is this connection between like Eastern and Western ideals of like Westernism. We have a lot of individuality within our practice, but that doesn't necessarily mean one is better than the other, but it's a different way of looking at it. But then who is using the other to gain, individual acclaim and material and capitalist wealth. And so like even seeing the people that were working there, they were doing these repetitive tasks in which they would wear out their bodies, especially like the throwers who made this tall vase I'm next to. Um, and so like two people would be working simultaneously. One would be pushing and supporting the other person's hands, and like their longevity in that job only lasted so long because the ligaments in their arms would tear from it. And so this made me really think about labor practices and what is expected, but actually like what is moral and how people are treated within systemic labor. And so that was a very pivotal point in my art practice in which I was really thinking about um, belongingness and labor and expectations of what bodies should be doing what kind of labor. And in grad school, I really was being in a very liminal space, which is like belonging to but not belonging to. So straddling that line of um, I I was making work that was talking a lot about strength and weakness. So using ceramics as a tool, as the material itself to talk about like the fragility, but also the strength of something. And so I created this piece called Anchored, in which this is a ceramic basket that is then hooked to a steel, it's almost like a beam, and that is attached to the back of the the chair of the school desk that I'm sitting in. So as I'm sitting there folding these origami balloons, the basket, it rocks up and down. So like there's that 1 to 2 inches between the tip of that basket and the floor, creating that tension of like the potential of it just cracking on that floor. And so with that, I was thinking a lot about my childhood, and I emigrated to the US at a very young age, and I had to assimilate to really survive, but also to as a bridge between my family and the world around me. And so I had to wrap my identity a lot around the construct of whiteness and learning how to code my behavior, speech, what I ate in public spaces, um, to really think about, to really kind of blend in. But you know, that blending in could never truly be because of what I look like. And so this, you know, having that responsibility, being a first child, like a first generation child of an immigrant family, I think like having to navigate and being that bridge is very common no matter what country we're from. It's very much, you have to shed something to gain something. So this is another part of that series where thinking about a balance of vessels and how bodies perform labor. And so I had to, during this time, I was thinking a lot about an inward dive, but then I started looking at the history of where I come from, as well as the history of Chinese immigrants to this country, to understand the privileges as well as the discrimination of this country that I do call home. But within that inward search, I had to also accept and embrace failure as a constant and not as a roadblock, but as an experience to learn and grow from. And this is a little bit of my process. I work through a lot of different forms, and so my process is also very repetitive, in which I'm creating forms that there are high failure rates. And even like my record performances, I go through a lot of, you know, sessions that I think of as failures. But so the forms from like the previous baskets, I go through like these phases in which I'm learning from the material and figuring out how they function and work, but then allowing the kiln to warp the work as well. So then it's like I have that control, but then I give up that control. And like working in this rate allows for my mind to really focus and almost like meditate on just like the tactility of working with that material and pushing it. And I think this has become something that I still gravitate toward, especially in our age of information abundance and instant gratification. Working this way allows me to really pause. So I'm a fan of failure, even though it's really heartbreaking when you spend so long in something. I've made 4 life-size bathtubs, and all of them have failed, but it's something that I will continue to think about and work on. And um, as an educator, that's something I embrace and share with students a lot, that like if the first time it's not what you want it to be, there's always a future. There's like being an artist, there's never like a finale, you know, even though there's like thesis shows, there's still room for you to make whatever you want, because you know, as an artist, we have that ability. And so working through all these different processes and experimentations and research has really informed me in how I perceive myself as a vessel, and how I've come to think and engage with the world in the way that I do. But then in doing so, I also had to look at the history of you know, Chinese Americans in this country, and why my experiences outside of myself are the way that they are. And that is within my individual research. Even though I have a degree in history as well, I never learned about my history until I was doing research for my own practice. And I learned that the first Chinese migrants to the US were people from my ethnic background, the Cantonese in southern China, and they were the primary labor source on the first transcontinental railroad that was built over 150 years ago, that ran 2,000 miles from San Francisco to Omaha, Nebraska, where a majority of the laborers on it were Chinese. But once the railroad was completed, they weren't allowed to ride back home on the railroad that they had just built, but instead were forced to walk back. And so this is the infamous image from that completion of that railroad, where none of the Chinese workers were even, documented as such. They were the invisible labor force. And so I found this to be really fascinating, and also learned that like 12 years after this, America had an immigration policy that were built upon laws like the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act that barred Chinese laborers from migrating to the US for a decade, even though they were the first labor source that was not invited, but because a lot of Black Americans who, they were brought over against their will, but the Chinese were, they were allowed in, but only incrementally. So the Chinese Americans were, at this point, they were discriminated through legal measures. And I think as the country that we still take for granted the blood, sweat, and tears that Black and brown folks have, they've literally built this country, but still are the ones who are expected to service, feed, and maintain it. And I attempt to address what it's like to live in othered skin, through this piece called Skin on Skin, Peeled and Mended. I created this porcelain loom that is fragile, delicate, yet strong enough to stretch and stitch all these orange peels onto. It's this very time-consuming endeavor that I'm racing against the peels drying too quickly while stitching it. The piece is pretty ephemeral as the peels are drying, they are pulling away from each other, and they're not preserved, so they're exposed to the elements, and I'm allowing this work to transform naturally. Of course, I've packaged it, but I don't look at it until I need to take it somewhere, and then like I'm surprised. But it's been preserving. And with this work, I'm referencing the labor that is expected of folks of color, that they work these menial jobs doing these heavy physical labor 7 days a week sometimes, all while carrying this emotional labor of repeatedly having to prove their Americanness. And I want people to imagine like this idea of being pulled apart, though, as you're trying to stitch yourself together, which is hard when you're drained physically, mentally, spiritually from work that doesn't fulfill someone. Like having purposeful work is what we all strive to have, as well as structures of support, but having to try to attempt to do everything ourselves very much fits back into this idea of American individualism, of having to make and do for ourselves and our family, without outside help, which is like not realistic. I really much consider process to be my primary medium, and I work with it in these like very experimental ways before I create these repetitious systems to physicalize my ideas. And so this is one project, and the process of this one project. I use a lot of significant materials for their characteristics and symbolic objects that compose experiences to tell the underlying emotions behind those experiences. I think it's difficult to emphasize by shared experiences, and some people will never have those. But I think like we all can connect to emotionality and think about how one might feel, you know, and to have certain things happen, but imagination is different from lived experiences. But I think that sharing emotions can allow a path for empathy to emerge from it. And so I think it's a very complicated and complex process of how we empathize. And so I think about that as I'm working through all of the different processes of my practice. So this is a process from my piece Black and Blue BS Theory. And within this, I have a 20-foot gem rope that I stitch all these molds of grapes called moondrop grapes. And I'm thinking of that phrase, like pull yourself up from the bootstraps, which is like romanticization of individual labor, of, you know, you just have to like do better and like you'll be better. But I think that a lot of people don't even have bootstraps to begin with, let alone boots sometimes. And so if they don't have the resources in which they can be pulling themselves up from, if they don't know the system of how things work, then they're constantly, you know, sliding down that rope. They're trying to upkeep and um, you know, trying to progress while also learning the system and navigate it, which I think a lot of folks are stuck on that. And so I think like being able to say you just pull yourself up from the bootstraps is very much a privileged thing, without consideration of these structures that require knowledge of in order to like, you know, progress. And so with this work, while I do have my process research, I also am thinking about these symbolisms behind it. So like these are the moondrop grapes that I created from, and these were created by geneticists in 2004 that became these low supply, high demand fruits. And I got them because they were really good, but they were expensive. And I was thinking about like why we spend energy to create these luxury goods at the expense of living bodies, because who is maintaining and growing these and who is picking them? But are they even, have they even tried them? You know, like, are they even making enough that they can purchase these? So then that makes me ask the questions like, why aren't we using our intellect and technology to advance all of us rather than just some of us? Especially when they're like luxury goods such as these. And so these forms really intrigued me because I thought that they were like also these very like sensual forms that seemed like erotic in a way because they're both like phallic and yonic. And I want to consider how a patriarchal system works in tandem with class and race oppression to polarize us through these gender binaries. And I was really influenced by Audre Lorde's essay, Uses of the Erotic as Power, in which she's talking about eroticism as it's like culturally misused term that calls for, that connects our imagery to like how we imagine the term erotic. It connects to pornography, which is like a direct denial of the power of erotic. Like erotic for her, she's talking about it as a realization of the erotic as the most responsible source of a woman's power. So being able to understand our true feelings and to emphasize sensation with feeling versus pornography emphasizes sensation without feeling. And so the erotic is a measure between the beginnings of our sense of self and the chaos of our strongest feelings, rather than what we think of it as today. And so, you know, doing research on these other, on intellectuals as well as women color who are writing and making work about the same, about similar concepts as I am. I found that I had been heavily influenced by Black women writers, especially Octavia Butler, who, um, she is a science fiction writer, but able to think about, how we can, what can allow us to fully come together without race and class as divisions. And so, like, thinking about the future, but also looking at the past is something that I waver a lot between. And as an Asian American and light skinned, I don't face the same overt discrimination, incarceration, and violence as those who are more melanated than me, and that they must endure. I think a lot about my own privilege of being able to access structures of power, especially thinking about the model minority myth that codes East Asians as being studious, complacent, and while we are the closest in proximity to whiteness, we will always be seen as foreign. And East Asians have always been these cultural propagandistic wedge between to keep historically marginalized folks separate. And so by having us be separate, we are being pitted against each other as a way to distract us from white supremacy. And so there have been a lot of resurfacing of xenophobic sentiments that have been around since the 19th century that was fueled by the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, the internment of Japanese Americans in 1942, and it's resurging with the coronavirus, especially being branded as a Chinese virus that signals to myself and people who look like me that we are to be blamed for this, but this isn't anything new. It might have just been buried really close to the surface, but these like surface level stereotypes justify a lot of hatred and violence on our bodies, especially on our elders and women. And so I think a lot about those intersections of what makes us who we are and when we need to recognize patterns that are toxic. That is similar to how I also have come to terms with my own practice, that this continued repetition, it might be good for my work, but is it good for myself and my body and my health? But I think like as a woman, I'm seen very differently than how I perceive myself. And especially as an East Asian woman, I'm seen through certain lens of objectification and fetishization. And this is a portrait I made in 2015 called M Butterfly that it references the late 19th century opera Madame Butterfly that has gone on to perpetuate the stereotypes of Asian women to be frail, docile, and self-sacrificial. These titles have changed to be Memoirs of a Geisha and Miss Saigon, but the plots are very much the same and reinforcing classic Asian exoticism. These are the only forms in which East Asian women are represented in popular culture, and naturally it influences the way that society as a whole think about real individual people. And it became very clear that after the Atlanta shooting last year, where 6 out of the 8 who were killed were East Asian women and were murdered by, and the murder was justified by the police as having just like a bad day, was extremely disheartening. But it wasn't surprising that that a white police chief would justify another white man having having specifically targeted these women as having a bad day, because it it's a form of gaslighting to say that, to make it okay when really like when we look at the patterns, um, it isn't like an outlier. It is pretty systemic in how we justify things like sex addiction, that is very much within power structure of patriarchal standards. Um, and so this like removal of individuality of East Asian women is extremely damaging to our mental psyche. It causes major developmental issues in terms of intimacy, identity, and especially how we navigate around the world and how then people in turn treat us. It causes problems within our culture as well because we don't acknowledge mental health because of struggles with it, especially within immigrant communities, that if we are physically fine and can work, then there really shouldn't be anything to complain about. But the bar is pretty low then when you think of it that way. And so this installation, it comprised of a video that I'm braiding hair in front of my face to highlight a feature that I've been fetishized for in my hair. Being asked by strange men to pet my hair is extremely disheartening, I guess. But I'm braiding in front of my hair to cover my face to remove my individuality, and then that is projected onto European style lace that is then displayed through a curtain of ceramic pinch discs, and then a final image, those discs cover my face completely. Oh, it's another one. And with that, I had referenced, media as a way to perpetuate stereotypical ideas, and this is a piece that is influenced by the movie The World of Susie Wong, which came out in 1960. I printed screenshots of the movie that I hand stitched all of the subtitles that were a part of it. And I view stitching as another repetitious act that, whether it's recorded in a video or seen evidently through stitches or pinch onto clay, all of those are these like subversive gestures that are historically tied to women's work, but these are also gestures that are against societal norms to highlight the absurd ways in which we view each other by engaging in these slow acts of labor. And so all of this is just, I didn't interject any of the text onto it, but I just printed them off as I saw fit, and then they were stitched and then reformulated into this arrangement. So sewing is like this very enduring, patient gesture, in my opinion, but it's also subtly violent because the action's stabbing it over and over again. But also then to highlight something is really interesting to me. And I work a lot of subtle detail into my work that I want to reflect the nuances of these daily jabs and how they dig mentally. And while they are subtle, the resulting image is rather jarring. So I incorporate a lot of like physical time and labor into the work through recording of, through video and photography. And so this is a very short clip of that piece. So sometimes the work surprises me, which is something that I like to continue, being surprised by my own work, is like the sounds of something, as well as how the sounds of something is always surprising to me. That's not a component I usually think about orchestrating. I'm really orchestrating the composition and the action. So it keeps exciting as an artist. This is a piece called Safe and Unsafe, and within this I'm thinking about like there are a lot of these diversity initiatives through institutions, and like as someone who has been tokenized into a diverse institution, quote unquote diverse institution, I'm thinking a lot how like if you're simply putting a diverse person into a situation, you're not diversifying that program, but really you're putting them into a hostile landscape. And it's not up to the individual to diversify it, but rather up to the institution to see the problems in which that person doesn't feel safe into, and to solve it internally, um, and to have structures in place to support them, rather than having to, having to be the one to be like, this is wrong constantly. So this is the piece that I made in an artist residency, in which I felt unsafe and being in a group of 50 other artists, and having microaggressions projected onto me every day. And so I had to find a space outside of that institution, um, to make something of. And this is why I created Remit, of making a shelter that is the same dimensions as my body, but you could just see my head as a way to kind of always be on guard and vigilant, to be looking around. And so my practice is, it covers a lot of things, that using different materials, but at the core of it, conceptually, it's all very much the same, but I'm thinking of different ways to talk about it. So I've always been fascinated by polar opposites of things, such as craft and video. I find a lot of empowerment through using videography, because at the beginning of video art in the late 60s, it was primarily women creating with it. It was an uncharted medium, unlike painting. Video allowed me to create my own forms of representation from a perspective that I can control. And a big influence for me was Ana Mendieta and her Silhouette piece, her Silhouette series, in which she was using her body and placing them and using the silhouette of it um, to place herself into these locations that she had been removed from. And another artist I'm deeply influenced by is Doris Salcedo. This is called a flor de piel, which is a blanket of preserved rose petals that are stitched together, that stretches about 40 feet across this gallery floor. She embarked on this very labor-intensive process to remember a Colombian nurse who was tortured to death. And so she treated this with a mixture of glycerin and collagen, and the rose petals defied aging as a purpose for keeping the nurse's memory alive. And this is very much ephemeral, even though like it is preserved, it mirrors a lot of human flesh, and the reddish tones remind me a lot of like the blood that was shed during, especially, for her as a Colombian person, through the tragedies of war and brutality. And like these instances aren't separated from us, but really like globally we're interconnected, especially when the US has helped to fund a lot of the violence and atrocities that have happened globally, especially when we think about like the global south, of how that we do have a finger in every single, a lot of different instances. And finally, like this, Yoko Ono is a huge influence, especially with this piece called Cut Piece, which is a performance that she had performed many times after this, but she sat on stage and invited the audience to approach her and cut away from her body, cut away her clothing. And this challenges the neutrality of that relationship between like the viewer and the art object, in which she is allowing the viewer to implicate this potentially aggressive act of unveiling her body, her female body, which serves as like historically has been like a neutral and anonymous subject for art. Like the female body has been depicted a lot in a way that it becomes an object, or an object to put something on, or object to insert into a landscape. But she is giving a lot of onus to the viewer, in which they could potentially really harm her, or even, they can hurt her, and like her hair had been cut in this piece as well. So this really was was influential, thinking about self as an object and the lack of autonomy and personhood one might have in a situation like this. And I realized how much I was influenced by that work when after I created this piece called Yellow Fever Agitations. And this reiterates my experiences as being objectified East Asian women. The sounds from this were also a surprise for me. So I have this suit covered with silicone nipples that I then flick each one back and forth. And I was really fascinated by like that flesh like slap that you hear. That despite the aggressive motion trying to flick something off, the white gaze always resettles onto the body, onto a body that might be deemed exotic and foreign. And I've shown this piece a few different ways, thinking about how an art object is rarely, it's expected to be static, that once you finish it, it is done. But that's a very rigid way of thinking about and creating art that I then put it into this home theater that I called Yellow Fever Agitation Sad Girl Blues Theater Edition, in which I'm thinking about like the act of performing in this space of being looked at, but really I can't look back. And so like as an artist, I think there's a lot of agency in what we do and how we share our work. And this is another piece thinking about the weight of cultural inheritance. It's called Under the Weight of Mom Minority Tears / Truck Nuts. And in the last like 10 years, I lived in a lot of white dominated communities, from coal country to wine country to oil country. And I think about the phrase of there's no such thing as racism against Asians. And I think about being a tokenized Asian, but I'm also thinking a lot about tokens of redneck pride, which are, you know, truck nuts on the back of trucks that you may have seen or not, but worth Googling. I'm thinking a lot about like fragile masculinity with this work, especially since they are these thinly pinched ceramic forms, but also within this experience, especially in the time that we live in, of thinking about hearing and being able to connect to other BIPOC folks and learning from them, and that in a way is uplifting. Because I used to feel very lonely about my experiences, especially being in white dominated communities. And so this is, you know, I think things are rarely just like positive, negative, but like what are the things in between? And so my work is very cyclical. I'm always coming back to ideas of belongingness and cultural inheritance, of working with my hands. I think because we're a little short on time, I'm just going to go through these fairly quickly, but I'm also thinking about how to engage with others and talking about heavy topics such as shame, and how craft is a really important and interesting way to think about connectivity to others, and thinking about how we can share our shame between each other and to collectively understand that while we might hold our shame separately and internally, there are a lot of ways in which, like, are we actually feeling it personally, or is shame collectively taught to tolerate complacency and to accept oppressions or perceived power? So yeah, a lot of what I'm thinking about right now is a lot of is, you know, how I can regain personhood of who I am, but like have it be connected but separate from how I'm expected to perform and what true authenticity means to me. And right now I'm looking a lot at my forebears. Historically, in my family, we've been farmers. And so I'm still doing the same thing that they were through these very repetitive tasks, but because of my position of being in academia and being able to vocalize and put these things into terminology that is then more accepted, it gives me a different way in which I can use repetitious processes to talk about, class, racial, and gender divisions. And so I'm really thinking about the radical opposition to productivity, which is kind of what I built my practice on, which is rest. And when did rest become a reward for overworking rather than the daily nourishment of just being human and present? So this is my grandfather in his field of bok choy, and I think a lot of immigrant families want their children to have like a really good job, but then that shouldn't be just like what we can attain, but like what we want to attain is can be beyond that of finding work that is purposeful, um, and that opens up a lot of other room for opportunities. And so I know this is a piece I have in the show, and we're coming short on time, but this piece feels like a culmination of all the work that I've shown previously. Death, growth, repeat. I'm sprouting these chia seeds on these terracotta tombstones as a meditation on growth in uncontrollable and unsustainable environments. And without this constant watering and tending, the sprouts are they're on these like unmarked and marked grave markers that will they'll either die or they will continue their growth cycle, but there is death always at the end of their inevitable demise. And so I'm using a lot of symbolic material language in here with the terracotta, the chia, the concrete basins, as well as the tile pedestals. And so, my name starts with an X, so in a way these feel deeply personal, but the X also, I'm thinking about how X marks the spot and how they could also be representative of any anonymous person. And especially having these shown now in a time of COVID in which so many lives have been lost. And even in events such as mass wildfires, where a lot of people haven't been documented into because of whatever reasons that they aren't deemed as valuable. These are a site in which I want to monumentalize and memorialize them and us. So yeah, I think that the personal is always political, and by political, I mean power and who has power to give voice to, um, and then to be able to thrive in a world that is not meant for everyone. So how do we reimagine a world that can sustain life rather than exploit it? And so I want to thank Kat and Amy and Rife Gallery, and everyone who helped me on this project, especially my friends Max and Katrina for your labor and love in helping this piece grow and thrive, and accepting the death of it. So thank you, everyone. You can find, that's my website and Instagram and stuff. So thank you for listening to me talk. If y'all have any questions, I'll be happy to take them.
Thank you so much, Ha. Folks, if you have questions, feel free to drop them into the comments or the chat. Would love to continue for the next few minutes in that. I appreciated your willingness to show failure. I think that that's a unique kind of learning mode within craft communities, ceramic communities specifically. And I'm curious if you have maybe a bit more that you could share on the importance of sharing the importance of failure with students particularly.
Yeah, I think that a lot of times we just see like the final product of something without actually knowing that it might be the eighth, 10th iteration of it. Um, and like working with a material that has its own, characteristics and attitude. Um, it's been very humbling that at first it was heartbreaking, but I think like working with a material like clay, um, it is mimicking a lot of how we experience life, I think. There are a lot of things that we think of as failure, as like, this is no longer good, but I think being able to reframe it as something that teaches us on how to learn another material and what it needs from us is almost like building a relationship with someone, of coming and meeting each other part way. Um, and I think like learning through failures is never like, oh, it was a waste of time, right? But rather like you're learning something that you can take into the next iteration with. So yeah, I think like craft materials are very poetic, especially one that humbles you in that way. So I encourage failure, and I with my students I give them room to, if something failed, something blew up, cracked, didn't glaze the way that they wanted to, I give them room to remake it. I think there should be a lot of flexibility with art making. Um, yeah.
Wonderful. So we have some comments. Cece said, uh, thank you, wonderful presentation.
Thank you, Cece.
Um, Amy said she's totally overwhelmed. That was so much. And that is like the highest compliment that you can get from Amy. So well done. Uh, Chiquita Mullins Lee said, I love that. Learning what the piece needs from us. Thank you. This was wonderful. So lots of folks, I think, kind of basking in the information that you've shared and just processing, which is wonderful. Oh, Amy has a question. You started to talk about interconnectedness, and I wonder if you can pull that into Shift, so the title of the exhibition.
Yeah, I think like with the exhibition, there were a lot of different ways in which our experiences were shown in the work. Like it is impossible to capture all experiences, but I'm thinking a lot about like my colleague Lorena specifically in her practice. Like while we both had growing work in there, but both of the work are coming from very conceptually different weight modes of thinking. Like mine was a little bit more open-ended, but hers was very specific in terms of her experiences with war and violence. And I think like the more that we're able to learn and be able to see the similarities but also differences in each other's practice is really important, and that there isn't like there is room for everyone's truths to be heard and to be shared, rather than, I think like that idea of like oppression Olympics is something that people get stuck on, of like, well, my experience was worse than yours, but really I think we could all learn from hearing each other openly, because we're all connected. Like even with the idea of how um, violence that happens in other countries, like how are we then, what are the ripple effects in which we might have helped caused it, or it will affect us. Um, and I think that's where I find a lot of influence from history of looking at what has come before and how like that was resolved or unresolved, in which affects us today. Um, Everything is connected. It's just like figuring out what that line is. And sometimes that line and that thread becomes very tangled. And so then like, but that is also something that I think a lot of spaces are attempting to do very purposefully, to tangle and confuse and pit us against each other as a way to distract us away from like higher modes of power that are being enacted in exploitive ways against our neighbors and friends and family. So
a lot of your work really flourishes with a good slow look, a good like contemplation, deep contemplation of the labor within it. And where I see a really interesting connection there, you mentioned that, you know, being within academia and having a history degree and the transcontinental railway not being something that was expressly explained, the roots of that and the labor of that. And so I think some things are coming more to light. But I would love for you to talk to the importance of discovery and research as an artist, and how you approach that and why it's so important.
I think a big part of being human is being curious about something, and it's just following that thread of curiosity. Sometimes I'm like, when I get really stuck on something, especially someone who has chronic depression, I look at how to take myself out of my own head, I'm doing a lot of reading and research about about certain topics I'm interested in, one of which is like history of Asian Americans. And by reading that takes me out of it, and then I'm able to re-engage with my work and being able to continue asking the question of why is really important. I think even with like, like when I ask students like, well, why do you think this? They're like, oh, a lot of times it's because they were raised that way, or they were socialized to believe that. But then asking them like, well, why do you really? And if they're just like, oh, my family, but then that question makes them question if that is something that they truly do believe. And so then they go down, a path of doing their own research, and that research helps support what they're physically making, because then they are investing more, they're investing more time and energy and emotional capacity into the work that makes it even more exciting for them. Because even if like someone doesn't know, like I have a lot of connections to the work that I didn't even share, like I'm pretty superstitious, especially with numbers, and how like 4 is a number for death, 8 is a number for luck in Chinese culture. Those things are important to me as a maker, as I'm working. But then I'm like doing more research into, superstition and folklore, but also like other ways of perceiving spirituality. And so I think just following that line of curiosity and doing digging into it, especially since it's so easy now through Google, I'm using things that could really be escapism, going into deep Google dives or using Instagram. I try to use that as a way to do research too. But I also, research in other ways. Like I like watching a lot of trash TV as a way to take my mind off of the more academic side, because then that is also like another research into looking at trends and social ways in which people are engaging in and trying to fit into certain modes. So I kind of view everything as research at this moment, because I think it all connects to each other and what I'm curious about in the world.
Wonderful. We have an additional comment from Cece. Said, yes, still processing. Very powerful work of art form, works of art, form of communicating. Thank you again. And then we have a question, a comment and a question from Sarah Petty. Says, awesome talk, Ha. I feel like craft can really value the maker to execute every aspect of themselves. Reflecting on your comment about your practice being demanding and maybe not so healthy, I wonder what your thoughts are about sharing the labor and possibly in doing so, creating connection and or community.
That's definitely something that I'm embracing more of. I have always been, I've always prided myself in being very independent, but then at what point does independence become almost toxic of having to do everything oneself? That goes back to assimilating to the idea of individualism, I think. And so like I'm trying to figure out how I can share that without burdening other people, which is something that maybe I also need to unlearn of like what I think is burdening other people. Um, I think working collectively with other folks it's a different way to think about work too, because like it is orchestrating, but then you also have to let go of that control. And right now, I think at this point of my practice, I'm learning how to let go with it slowly. And right now, it's through plant matter. But I do think at the core of that, like even thinking about agricultural practices and farming communities, like it is through community in which like that community can thrive by helping and supporting each other. So that's where my research right now is heading into, of thinking and looking at like even the community that I was born into, which is a farming village, of how they have been helping each other, even through a lot of hardship, in which like one person's crop might have been failing one year, and so the whole community helps them. Um, so I'm trying to embrace it more, but it's hard. Trying not to like burden other people. Um, so it's like it's a give and take. But thank you, Sarah. I think that's a really good thing to consider, because like we can't always do everything ourselves, and sometimes that sometimes you have to like go through a tough period to understand that. Even if you think that, then how do you enact that new thought into practice, which is sometimes hard.
Yeah, wonderful. I think that that is really a pretty perfect place for us to end on. So again, big thank you to Zhang for taking the time to share her story, your story, and work with us. Also to Maria Sater-Reeder, the curator of this great exhibition, Shift, Thinking Globally, Acting Locally. And of course, thank you to the Ohio Arts Council's board, the governor and the legislature for supporting the Ohio Arts Council's Rife Gallery, which allows us to highlight and celebrate Ohio's immensely talented professional artists. Thanks everyone, and have a great day.